Will the Falcons surprise us by going towards another position besides edge rusher in round one?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL. You'll get $20 off your first purchase. So, guys, if you do not know me, I am your humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, a.k.a. the Jolly Green Giant, a.k.a. Mr. a.k.a. I've been covering the Falcons for too many years, formerly at falcons.com, RIP, still going strong on this illustrious podcast. And today I am joined by none other than Will McFadden of the Believe in Falcons podcast, of alcoholic, former beat writer for the AtlantaFalcons.com, to talk about the Falcons, draft plans and how it seems like, all signs are pointing towards edge, corner, and wide receiver early in the draft. But will the Falcons throw us a curveball? So we'll get into that conversation with Will McFadden, as well as talk about some other positions of need, the signings of Kevin King and James Smith-Williams right now. Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of Locked On Falcons, of course, with an illustrious guest. He is Will McFadden, the host of the Believe in Falcons podcast, as well as a contributor to the Falcoholic, former contributor to AtlantaFalcons.com. So he knows this Falcon team better than almost anybody, because, your humble host knows the team so well. But Will, my friend, welcome back to Locked On Falcons.
Thanks, Aaron, for having me. Yeah, man, I judge myself based on you. They say iron sharpens iron. You're a whole heck of a lot of iron, dude. So thank you for having me on. I'm excited to chat about the team.
Okay, well, we might have a new AKA. So the Falcons are heading in the draft, right? And it seemed to me that everything was sort of setting up for the Falcons to prioritize like three positions at the top of the draft: edge rusher, cornerback, and wide receiver. Maybe they threw a little bit of a wrinkle in that, signing a couple of corners and edge rushers in the past 72 hours, including former Packers cornerback Kevin King and Commanders edge rusher James Smith-Williams on Monday, but we'll talk about that a little bit later in the episode. But, it does feel like, at least from my perspective, that, looking at the strength of this draft class, looking at the Falcons' needs, all that stuff, it sets up pretty well for them to maybe go edge rusher in round one and then cornerback and wide receiver in some order with two of their next three day two picks. Do you think that's a fair assessment? Do you agree with that sort of assessment?
Yeah, I mean, I think that they are in a great spot to address any one of those three positions. And that's ultimately what I think they wanted to get to with about less than a month to go until the draft. And when you look at the way Terry Fontenot has approached each offseason, and now we've seen this carry over with a different head coach, and it hasn't been to the same extent every offseason. I think the first couple of years were really, really focused on kind of like penny stocks. We're going to try to get somebody in here at great value, hope that either there's a reason their value is diminished, they're a veteran player. I think back to like a lot of the moves they made in the secondary over the first couple of seasons there with Arthur Smith and Terry Fontenot to bring in veterans like Eric Harris, Ron Harmon, who are at the tail end of their career, but still offered some value. Or, maybe you make some of those lower tier guys that you may not, know super well, like a Caden Ellis or somebody like that, and you invest in their upside that their best days are ahead of them. And so if you look at the moves that they made this offseason, Kirk Cousins is not an under the radar move. Like, that's as high key a move as the Falcons have made since they've been here. But they did do what they have done regardless of how much they're investing, and that is address their needs. And so getting quarterback really figured out, and more importantly, I think getting wide receiver depth figured out a little bit. They haven't necessarily finished that room, in my opinion, but they're in a better spot than they were a month and a half ago. And that does line them up to go whichever direction they feel is their best path in the draft, whether that is edge at, in the first round, if they think a difference maker is there. But honestly, if they feel like the upside of one of these corners is like all pro potential, and maybe there's just a fringe pro bowler out of this Dallas Turner, Jared Verse, Laiatu Latu mix, but they really feel, hey, Quavon Mitchell is like a perennial all pro, then they could do that. And I think they could circle back around in the second round with an edge or address their offensive or defensive line. Same with wide receiver, right? We talked about any of these 1A guys kind of falling down there to 8. I'd be totally fine with them taking a wide receiver and then figuring out defense later on, because the depth is pretty solid for all 3 of these spots. So yeah, they've done a great job kind of setting themselves up to take whatever path they want to. You and I talked a little bit about the edge path. I still think that would be the way that I would go, but I've been thinking a lot about these corners as well, man.
Yeah, definitely. So, of course, because I'm like going into the draft thinking it's going to be an edge in round 1, and then probably a corner and wide receiver on day 2, they'll do something completely different. So as you outlined,
yeah, it's going to be Brock Bowers. You heard it here first.
There you go. And we'll talk maybe about some other positions that the Falcons may target early a little bit later in the episode. But I do want to kind of focus in on those 3 spots, edge, corner, and wide receiver, and maybe pick your brain, Will, on a couple of guys that you like at those positions that, potentially will be on their radar in round 1. And we'll do that as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. And now that spring is here, it's about time to get out and about and be more social. And, you wonder, what's the right amount of socializing for you? How do you recharge? Maybe you thrive around people. Maybe you need some alone time. Therapy can give you that self-awareness to build a social life that doesn't drain your battery. One of the things my therapist has worked with me is to try to find ways to maximize my social battery. And I don't know, without my therapist, that I would have been as willing to attend the Senior Bowl and hang out with the Ian Rappaports and all that the past 2 years. So I highly recommend therapy. It's benefited me. It can benefit you. And if you're thinking of starting therapy, BetterHelp is your best option. It's entirely online. It's designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist, and you can switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Find your social sweet spot with BetterHelp by visiting betterhelp.com/lockedon today, and you'll get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. So as we continue today's Locked On Falcons, before we continue our conversation about some prospects that the Falcons may be looking at, I got to tell you, one prospect that you guys should be checking out, at least in terms of your content, is the Locked On Podcast Network with their free 24/7 streaming sports channel, Locked On Sports Today program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all of the screaming that you find on the other 4-letter networks. Locked On Sports Today brings you that can't miss analysis, opinions, and news, and is streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. You can also check out Locked On Sports Atlanta on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app if you want to get more local flavor of those can't miss analysis, opinions, and more. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So talking with Will McFadden of Believe in Falcons, we talked about edge, corner, wide receiver. You've mentioned a couple of names that, maybe in the mix in that round 1 or later. Are there sort of individual players or prospects that sort of stand out to you at some of those positions that you're sort of being like, if you could nudge the Falcons in that direction? Who are some of the players that you're looking at?
Yeah, I think that when it comes to edge, you and I spoke on Believe in Falcons last week about Laiatu Latu, and he is somebody where I know that if you're looking at it in terms of pure athleticism, you're gonna favor Dallas Turner, right? If you're looking for maybe more of your prototypical pass rusher of kind of the last decade and a half, 2 decades, probably looking at Jared Verse. He's got kind of that power speed combo. He's a nice long athlete. There's a lot to like there. But when I just look at Laiatu Latu, I think that he, in the short term, and given the move that the Falcons made to go get Kirk Cousins, you have to imagine that they are thinking, at least in the short term. Last year was seen as an underachievement. They like the roster, the progress that it has made and the kind of direction it's headed in. They feel like they do have a lot of young talent on this team that maybe has not reached its potential for various reasons, but a lot of that they feel like has to do with the quarterback position. So now that you've addressed that, you hopefully you're going to get a rising tide lifts all offensive boats. So that's where I do think they are going to target defense early, and Latu, because of the shorter window, I think he's a guy who comes in here early on and fits a little bit more cleanly what they're trying to do. And we spoke about how he moves around the defense, can kind of play in multiple spots. You can not match up Hunt maybe with a rookie, but you could give him more favorable matchups, I think. And he probably fits a little bit better with the other players you have on this roster. So that is why Latu is kind of emerged at the top for me with my edge guys. And he frankly was kind of early on in the process. And then I think I got wowed by the athleticism for the other guys. But if you look at, kind of your Chop Robinsons, your Braylon Trices, those guys, like, I don't know if they wow me in the way that these guys do. So that's why I think you're seeing a lot of us circle at edge in that top 10, because the drop off is a little bit more severe. I think I'm not going to get into necessarily the top guys at wide receiver, because we know who those are. Instead, somebody that I keep really thinking a lot about in the second round is Robin Wilson out of Michigan. I just think that he is a little bit of a athlete, smaller dude who can win in space and run away from guys. And I just picture him so cleanly running these kind of delayed over routes, these mesh routes, these man beaters, when you've already got guys who are eyeing Drake London, Kyle Pitts. He could just operate in kind of that interim space, a little bit like Rondale Moore, but now you've got a second bite at the apple. Ricky Pearsall is another player that I think a lot of people have kind of in that same mindset, that same build. And Ladd McConkey, I think, is the rich man's version of all of these guys. Mm-hmm. I would take Ladd McConkey at 8 personally. Like, I love that dude to death. So, and I'm not just saying that as a Georgia fan. I think he's going to have a long and really good career. And so then if you look at corner is where it's really interesting, because I think that this is a very, like, beauty is in the eye of the beholder position, even mm-hmm. with the top guys. Somebody could love Terrion Arnold's combination of athleticism and tenacity and just what he brings to the table in terms of not a raw prospect, because he's really good and polished, but just the ball of clay is amazing. However, you could look at Cooper DeJean and be like, he's a fluid, smooth operator with a lot of versatility, can play safety, could move down into inside nickel. You could even maybe pop him outside if you needed to. Good run defender. So those are just two stark examples where the Rams, I could see being all in on Cooper DeJean. Raheem Morris came from LA. However, I could see Raheem Morris being all in on Terrion Arnold because of just that dog in him. Same with Quinyon Mitchell. So at the top of the draft, I think it's a little harder to sort those top guys, which is why I think you could see 1, 2, 3 of the guys who we're currently mocking in that like 15 to 25 range, be that Nate Wiggins, be that a number of different guys. They could be there maybe at the top of round 2, or a big run could happen. So that's why I think there's more of those later first round names. Kool-Aid McKinstry, guys like that are the ones maybe a little bit more on my radar if they want to maybe move back up if that run's happening. If they are totally set on some day 2 corners, Mike Sainristil still is a name that kind of keeps jumping out to me just because of the former wide receiver aspect to his game. And I think the Falcons need a little bit more of a ball hawk in their secondary outside of Jesse Bates. Ennis Rakestraw is a similar type of player. Max Melton, also good. Renardo Green. These are some of the kind of corner names that I've not only seen linked to the Falcons, but just in kind of watching them myself and thinking about how this defense could operate. Those are some guys that could maybe on day 2 be a nice little pickup.
Yeah, I think, a lot of interesting names there that you mentioned, Will. A couple of guys I still need to watch, but several of the guys that I have watched, they're all good players. There's a reason why those guys consistently get mocked, in the first couple of rounds of the draft. And, you know, I think it all kind of sets up well. Again, going back to the initial question and conversation we were having about, like, it does feel like if the Falcons go edge, corner, and wide receiver in a certain order, like the board does kind of break favorably for them because you have such a strong wide and deep wide receiver class that, if you wanted to wait and get a guy on day three, or not the day three, the third round, rather than taking that guy the second round. As you mentioned, maybe you get one of those high end corners that is projected to go in round one, falling to you in round two. So if you go edge early, corner, and then wide receiver, but of course, as I say this, the Falcons will find a way to zig when we expect them to zag. But I do want to talk a little bit more about maybe some positions that also may be in the mix, as well as potential players. But I do also want to talk with you about the two latest free agent signings that the Falcons have made in Kevin King and James Smith-Williams. And we'll break that down, guys, as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So, guys, spring is here and baseball is back, and Game Time is now an authorized ticket marketplace for Major League Baseball, which makes getting baseball tickets even faster and easier. With killer last-minute deals, all in prices, views from your seat, their lowest price guarantee. Game Time is taking the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets. Those last-minute deals mean that, as things get closer to the first pitch, you're actually going to be saving money. Flash deals mean that, you get in-app exclusives, on select seats ahead of the game. All in prices means you don't have to worry about any hidden or surprise fees at checkout. And of course, you love the panoramic view from your seat that you can see in the app before you buy. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time by downloading Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL, LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. So as we continue here with Will McFadden of Believe in Falcons as your first listen today, tomorrow's first listen will be joined by Savion Mixon of the Sporting News to talk more about the Falcons draft plans and maybe some players that he has his eyes on. But Will, as we talk about sort of edge, corner, wide receiver being, three potential of the first picks for the Falcons do have 4 picks in the first 3 rounds. So that leaves room to use one of those premium picks on another spot. And, of course, best player available, all that stuff and more, that's the mantra that the Falcons believe in. But, if you were a betting man, right, is there a particular spot that you would look at, or spots that you would maybe favor that you could see the Falcons going for early in the draft? And there potentially, is there a particular player that you have your eye on for those spots?
The interesting thing about this draft, I think, compared to a lot of the ones in recent memory, is that the Falcons are back to a point where, outside of addressing the 3 main positions that we just talked about, like, I think a lot of what they can do is looking at building their depth with either really high-end developmental guys, and I think about Zach Harrison last year as like a good example of that, or, maybe that is where they decide to add very specific skills. I think, how much, Aaron, do you think special teams and the changes to the kickoff are going to impact the way that teams decide to build their roster and prioritize certain body types in the draft?
It's going to be interesting to see how it impacts the league. I think really you'll probably see, I guess to answer that question, I'm kind of expecting teams to kind of do some things in this year's draft, and there'll be certain players that will maybe go a round or 2 higher that will be like, oh yeah, that guy's clearly a special teams guy. But I honestly think like next year it's gonna be the year where you're gonna actually see the impact of some of these players with the new kickoff rules and some of the rule changes, and that's gonna cause a lot of people, because there's gonna be certain teams that are like ahead of the curve. I was listening to a podcast the other day, and they were talking about the Chiefs signing the rugby player from Wales, right? And how like the whole, like, now you can do like laterals and stuff with, like, which is a natural.
You've always been able to do laterals, but teams
like
just
it's
are
like
scared
with the way that the kickoff is set up now, like you can do like full field laterals or something like that. which I mean, you could do, but like it was very
See,
sketchy.
you're talking
Yeah.
my language now. I played rugby in college, and I've been waiting for teams to, like, I say scared as a joke, but they're scared, man. There's so much advantage and potential here if teams, and there's a play that the UFL or Canadian Football League ran. No, it was the UFL. Sorry, that you see literally a guy on the front line who is lined up in that starting zone run a reverse. And so, yeah, the man catches the ball, he's returning it, and he just kind of veers off. And because these guys are probably first and foremost going to be blockers, if your job is run down and tackle the return man, you're not necessarily keeping an eye on where he's going. And I'm worried, like, not worried, I'm wondering about the communication. How do these guys communicate up it? Because that's a huge part of rugby. And the other thing that is very similar to this is if you break that one line of defense, you've got a chance to take it all the way. It's much more like Red Rover now. So that's where I think you're going to be. It's not necessarily the returner that I think is going to be different. It's what body types do teams feel give them advantages in that kind of starting zone, right? Do you want to load that up with bigger receivers, Mohamed Sanu, Cordero Patterson, players like, although we know Cordero would be a returner, but you get my point. Or yeah, Mac Hollins would probably be perfect in that type of role because he's tenacious, he's athletic, you can use him in different ways. However, I could also see 5 offensive linemen, like just reserve dudes who are out there who you can then run traps with. You could have a pulling guard. Like there's so much creativity. So that's kind of my point is once we get into these 3rd, 4th, 5th rounds, I wouldn't be shocked if we start seeing a little bit more of the bigger bodied guys go than we used to see because we started seeing a lot of tight ends, fullbacks, bigger receivers. I wouldn't be shocked if we start seeing more athletic linemen offensively and defensively start going there to build out these special teams units a little bit more differently. So that's kind of my point is the Falcons are going to be in a unique spot once they get their kind of top line needs addressed because they don't have that many holes on their roster. What they can start doing instead is looking at Grady Jarrett, as much as we hate this, isn't going to be here forever. David Onyemata isn't going to be here forever. Jake Matthews isn't going to be here forever. So maybe they do double dip on the defensive line and maybe they go edge in the 1st round and come back around in the early 3rd and they take an interior guy who has some of that like 4-eye technique versatility or could bump inside and be a small nose or something like that. So they can almost plan for the future now in a way that they haven't been able to. But I hope in the process, they also target some of the positions where there could be a more immediate impact. I do think they could add a couple more guys in the secondary. You know, they could get a safety to come in here and really compete with Richie Grant and with Marco Helms, even though I'm excited to see what Marco Helms brings in year 2. So it's a long and a bad answer, honestly, Aaron, because I'm not giving you just like very specific things, but it's because there's more paths available for the Falcons at this point than there really have been recently. And I think that's a testament to the shape of the roster right now.
That's fair enough. Well, speaking of the shape of the roster, the Falcons, reshaped it a little bit on Monday, adding Kevin King and James Smith-Williams. Do you, what are your expectations for those 2 players in Atlanta? And, do you potentially think those moves, we should read a lot into that as sort of indicative of what the Falcons may do in the draft?
Yeah, I wouldn't read into it too much. I think that this is, again, an example of something that Terry Fontenot liked to do, even dating back to New Orleans. And it's getting guys with a little bit, in the case of Kevin King, like a higher pedigree. He was not just a 2nd round pick, but he was the 33rd overall pick. So he was like pick number 1 in the 2nd round. That's obviously there's a reason for that. And things didn't work out for him, opposite of Jair Alexander. Even though the Packers secondary with Jerry Gray for a long time there was really good, he wasn't that guy that developed the way everybody hoped he would. He wasn't horrible. He was just inconsistent. And I mean, that's kind of the story of the Falcons' number 2 cornerback position for everybody not named Robert Alford. And I think that this is just it's not a camp body because at this point right now, like everybody who's in the Falcons secondary and on this roster, they would love to, I think, have around because they don't have a ton of depth and they haven't gotten to the part where you're adding just these pure camp bodies, right? We kind of all know once that time comes and you're like, yeah, Tease Tabor, probably not going to be like even though I think they actually liked him in camp and he was putting on a good camp. When I saw that, I was just like, I don't expect him to actually be hanging around come October. But that could be what this ultimately ends up being. Or again, the upside is that he's not going to cost you a whole heck of a lot. And if he does somehow recapture or it just clicks the right way, and obviously I mentioned Jerry Gray, there's familiarity here, which is a big thing for a lot of these guys that the Falcons want to bring in. They want to know what they're investing in. And he could have an impact in helping change and instruct what this defensive change is going to be. In terms of Smith Williams, again, I think that right now the Falcons do just have kind of a lot of bodies at the edge rush and interior. It's more the interior guys that I'm curious to see. Like, I think that's room is going to change a little bit. But again, at this point, I think they're being a little bit more specific about bringing in players who have a little bit more comfort and familiarity with what the new coaching staff is going to ask of this group. So a lot of times you will see somebody who's not brought in for their on-field impact in 4 or 5 months, but more for their on-field or in the classroom impact, kind of like right now and in these next 2 to 3 months as they're getting ready and ramping up for training camp. So, you could ask me 3 weeks into training camp after I've seen Smith Williams sack the quarterback 3 times, and then I'll have a different answer for you. But at this point in time, I think it's an upside play for Kevin King, and I think it's a little bit more of just adding comfort, familiarity, another voice for Smith Williams.
Fair enough. Well, Will, I appreciate your insight into those moves as well as the Falcons draft plans. We'll just sort of have to see what happens and which edge rusher the Falcons will take and inevitably create another civil war within the fan base post-draft until the inevitable civil war when Kirk Cousins, becomes the focus of all of our attention come August, as is the way of the world. That's, just like if we're not arguing about a quarterback, then what are we doing, right?
I just want people to can we galvanize behind whoever this pick is, right? It's as long as if they imagine us clamoring for an edge rusher for all these years, and then that's what they decide to do, and it's just like they didn't get the right one.
Yeah,
any one of these 3 is going to be better than anybody they've drafted in a long time.
I think that's a great perspective, Will, but like that, no one cares. You have to get my guy or else you're dead to me. But that being said, let the people know, what are some of the things you'll be bringing to them on Believe in Falcons over the next 2.5 weeks, I think, between now and the draft.
Yeah, I'm going to line up a conversation with Mike Rothstein from ESPN one time before the draft gets going to just kind of talk final team needs, again, the state of the roster at that point. And also hoping to lock down a conversation with Jordan Rodriguez, who covers the Los Angeles Rams for The Athletic and does an incredible job. Just want to kind of touch base with her about Zach Robinson, Raheem Morris, how Raheem evolved over there and what Zach is going to bring to the table. So that's kind of what we've got coming in the near future. And of course, a lot of draft talk as well. And then on the Falcoholic, got a weekly mailbag coming up on Thursdays. And that's kind of really all I'm doing writing wise right now, because got a lot else going on. But yeah, and you can follow me on Twitter at Will McFadden, nice and easy.
So guys, that's going to do it for us here. Appreciate Will for joining me. Tomorrow, of course, we'll be joined by Savion Mixon of the Sporting News, talk more draft stuff. And of course, continue to make us your first listen. For your second listen, check out Locked On Sports Today, Locked On Sports Atlanta. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.